If you wouldn't mind, please calling the roll.
Counsel King.
Present.
Counsel DeBon.
Present.
Counsel King. Counsel Harris.
Present.
Counsel Hughes.
Present.
Counsel LaForest.
Present.
Counsel Leeang.
Present.
Counsel Calmucci. Chairman Moore.
Present. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a quorum. Before I begin, I'd just like to read to the record the open meeting law, which is as follows. Pursuant to the open meeting law, any person may make an audio or video recording of this public meeting or may transmit the meeting to any meeting. Attendees are therefore advised that such recordings or transmissions are being made whether perceived or unperceived by those present and are deemed acknowledged and permissible. And we have before us this evening Council Order 2016-82, which is an update from the city's financial advisor as well as bond counsel, who we're joined with both this evening. I invite the city's financial advisor, Cindy McNerney, to join me at the podium. Be so kind. And I'd also like to just put forth my appreciation to my fellow councilors. I know we're starting this meeting super early, so thank you very much for being flexible in your schedule. The forum this evening essentially will be an overview by Ms. McNerney, who really is going to give some perspective and some backdrop, particularly to some of the newer counselors on the city's finances as a whole, drill down on some of the items such as debt management and how that all ties back into the overall package, which is examined and put forth in terms of a rating on our capacity to borrow. So without further ado, Cindy, the floor is yours. Good evening.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. My name is Cindy McMurray. I'm a managing director at First Southwest Company in Boston. And we provide the city, First Southwest Company, I'll just say quickly, is basically the successor to what had been Fleet Bank, Bank of America, Bank of England, Bank of Boston, all these different groups that over the last 40 years have consolidated and put into what we now are at First Southwest Company. And we provide advice to cities and towns and municipal entities, states, agencies on how to issue debt, how to structure debt, how to protect your credit, and improve your credit. So with that said, that puts in context, we serve as financial advisor to the city of Quincy, and we assist the city in bringing all of its debt to market, and we help the city look at its credit, the makeup of its credit. We give advice relative to some of the decisions the city has to make with regard to fiscal policy, and we help the city look at different iterations of bond structures to look at what might be affordable, what might be most desirable, taking into consideration what's going on in the market and the city's capacity to take on new debt. And we work with the city looking at various debt models. Probably every time the city issues debt, we update that debt model, and probably at least quarterly, we are updating and re-looking at what might make sense with regard to a debt model. And the debt model takes into consideration existing debt service of the city, that's principal and interest payments, is debt service on outstanding bonds. And then it adds on both short-term and long-term debt for all the prospective financing that the city is looking at. Currently, the city's latest debt model incorporates probably at least 100, maybe 110 or 12, $15 million worth of debt, new debt issuance to take out existing short-term debt and bring on some new projects over the course of the next 5 years. The city's currently got about $180 million worth of outstanding debt. We have a separate debt model for the city's DIF plan, DIF district, and what it's doing with regard to the debt that's issued to date for DIF. And basically that debt is structured to mirror what is anticipated to be the revenue stream associated with that project and all the projects that make up the DIF projects. And to the extent that the city got some special legislation that allows it to structure that debt in a special way outside the general law. Most debt in Massachusetts is structured pursuant to Mass General Laws, Chapter 44. And the state has very conservative rules with regard to conservative laws as to how you can structure debt. Short-term debt is generally issued for 1 year at a time. It's called bond anticipation notes. The city's got it's close to $70 million worth of bond anticipation notes outstanding right now. That includes the $40 million that's currently outstanding for DIF. And
Is that, I'm sorry, just kind of interject, and I hope this is conversational as possible. When you talk about the band debt, did you say 70 million roughly?
yes,
And then you have about 180 million in overall debt issued?
outstanding bonds and about $70 million of short-term notes outstanding.
Two separate items.
Two separate items.
The diff and obviously the budget, which we'll go through this evening. The first part of those two conversations with the diff and the budget, those are compartmentalized and handled each on their own merit, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
So when the city issues debt, part of it is supported by either a user fee or part of it's self-supporting. So the assumption is water, sewer, and DIF are self-supporting. The rest of the city's debt is supported by the property tax. And so it's important to separate out when you're looking at modeling the city's debt as to what's supporting it, because you can't just mix it all together. If it's got water user fees or sewer user fees or the revenues coming in from DIF, then we're looking at that separately as opposed to the property tax. So what's supported by the property tax is what needs to fit into the city's budget. So when you budget, you budget the expenditures of the city. One of the components of one of the line items is debt service. And that's how much you budget to pay principal and interest on long-term debt and interest on short-term debt. The benefit of short-term debt is that you don't have to start to pay back the principal yet. Under Massachusetts law, you can issue that for 2 years without having to pay any principal, and up to 5 years, but you have to start making payments if you roll that short-term debt past year 2, as if you were selling bonds. But what that short-term debt allows you to do is to aggregate borrowing needs and have them all mature, have the payment date be on the same date, aggregate it all, and then sell it as a bond. A bond takes out the short-term debt. So you might issue a note for $5 million, have it go out for 1 year, and in 1 year you issue a $5 million bond, pay off the note, and now you take the bond and you pay it back over many years. You pay back the principal and interest on that bond.
So you can basically roll a band for 2 years consecutively. That's per Mass General law. And then you got to bring it to market in terms of the bond.
Not until year 5, but you can renew it for 5 years, but if you renew it past year 2, you have to start paying down the principal as if you had sold a bond.
And initial band, is that a 1 year maturity or they fluctuate?
It could be up to 1 year. It could technically be longer, but it's technically 1 year, generally. And so the general laws prescribe how long different purpose bonds can be sold for example, and generally it's based on the useful life of that asset. So any kind of construction bond or remodeling bond can go for 30 years, up to 30 years. It doesn't have to. So if you can afford to pay it back in 20, that's what we look at with the city. We look at whether or not some of the school construction debt that's planned should be paid back in 20 years or 30 years, and how it looks. You can also structure it to look like a mortgage payment, so that the annual payment of debt service is approximately equal every year, or you can structure it so that it's it's declining debt service. The city has both kinds of debt outstanding right now, and so when you look at the city's profile of outstanding debt on bonds, it's actually declining every year, which allows the city to bring on more debt. Some of the largest projects, have been issued looking like a mortgage payment. Part of the reason to have a project go out for 30 years rather than 20, even if you can afford it, is because the asset lasts that long, the longer term, and because that way the people who are benefiting from the project are the people who are paying for the project, as opposed to paying it off sooner, and the people who live in the city for the first 10 years of the project paying off more of their share of the cost in the way some people look at it. So the cities, so what we look at the debt in a lot of different ways, and it's not really cast in stone. We try to maintain flexibility. The debt component of the city's credit rating is only 10% of how the city's credit is evaluated. There's two rating agencies, both rate the city's debt right now, Moody's and Standard & Poor's. There's other rating agencies, but those are the two primary rating agencies, and those are the two that rate the city's debt right now. The city's rated stronger with Standard & Poor's. It's currently rated a AA+. That's one notch from the best rating you can have, AAA. And Moody's has a different, they don't use pluses and minuses like Standard & Poor's does. They use 1s, 2s, and 3s, and the city is the lowest of the AA category with Moody's at AA3. City hasn't used Moody's for probably 2 years. It didn't have to use two ratings, so it used the higher of the rating, because if you have a split rating and you use them both and one is lower than the other, the bonds tend to price to the lower of those ratings. So we've been using the Standard & Poor's rating, and their methodologies in terms of how they evaluate credit is a little bit different. So I'm just going to talk about Standard & Poor's evaluation, because that's the one we care about most. In Massachusetts, I'll just give you a little perspective. In Massachusetts, there's 351 cities and towns. There's a number more water districts and fire districts and all sorts of regional school districts. Most of the municipalities in the state are rated, well, probably out of that, probably 200 have ratings. I might be off a little, maybe 225. There's probably combined between both Moody's and Standard & Poor's, probably about 60 AAAs in the state. Then there's probably that same amount. I think it's less than that actually of AA pluses, and that's where the city of Quincy is. And then below that, there's the majority of issuers in the state are in the AA category. So that reflects, and that's very different than the rest of the country. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts has a lot of growth and a lot of strong management. One of the criteria in terms of how Standard & Poor's looks at the city's credit rating, and 10% of the rating is based on this, is institutional factors. That's one of the laws that govern the way that the city operates. An example is you're required to have a balanced budget. So that's a very strong credit feature from the perspective of the rating agency. You can't get in too much trouble if you have to have a balanced budget, even if you balance it by using reserves, which actually the rating agency is not in favor of. They're looking in the last 5 to 10 years, the shift has gone from looking at historical trends to looking at prospective estimates as to how are you facing the future, what are you dealing with. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But they are primarily interested in structural balance, where your ongoing revenues match and tie up with your ongoing expenditures. Then to the extent that your revenues exceed your estimates and your expenditures are under what you budget, then you have an operating surplus. And they grade you on whether or not you annually have an operating surplus or not. That's another 10% of your rating. So right now we've got 10% from the institutional framework, and that's how the laws govern the municipalities. Some more of the way they govern you is how they allow you to structure debt. You can't get into a lot of trouble with the way you're allowed to structure debt. Like I said, it has to be equal principal or level debt service. And what that, so you're not allowed to have, for example, balloon payments, term bonds that don't have mandatory payments as if they were serial bonds. I know I'm throwing out a lot of terms right now, it's hard to get into this.
Can I just ask one question?
Sure.
I know that Quincy's not your only client. You obviously oversee other cities and towns.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, when you think about this, and it's a learning experience for me as well. When you talk about operating surpluses, which is higher revenue with less expenditures, I mean, how many other cities and towns do you really see? It doesn't seem like it would be something you see every day.
That have an operating surplus?
Yeah.
No, but most of them do. Most municipalities are very conservative in how they budget, and you wouldn't get into, you wouldn't be in the AA category, especially AA plus, one notch below AAA, if you weren't really well run and really strong in terms of all of the different factors that go into the credit. So we work with probably 30-some, I think it's probably about 35 of the state's 44 cities at this point. We work with a lot of them, and probably 150 towns. We see a lot of we see a lot of the inner workings of what's going on between different cities, and most of them, I've been doing this for a long time. They've evolved over time, and there's now a lot of guidance from the Department of Revenue, from people like me, from special consultants that are providing advice. And every year, municipalities have learned more and more about the process, and I think they've taken on the responsibility to do more and more with regard to delivering on procedures, established procedures with regard to how they govern themselves, establish fiscal policy with regard to what their goals are. The city is actually, management makes up 20%. So I'm going to tell you what the makeup is of the credit so that you can, so the institutional framework, which is pretty conservative, we get a very high mark for that, not the highest, but pretty close to the highest mark, is 10%. 20% is management, and we'll talk about management in a minute. 30% is the economy, and so 30% of, you can't really control the economy, even though the city of Quincy is doing an awful lot with regard to promoting economic development in its downtown and contributing, its share to attract investment with all of the DIF projects that are in the works. So we're up to 30%, and then another 30% is financial results. And that includes liquidity, how much cash does the city have, what are your operating results, and whether or not you've got what are your level of reserves, and whether or not you have structural balance. Do you annually have an operating surplus? And that's I think we're up to, and then 10% for debt. And 10%, so you can tell debt is not going to drive the day, although, and Quincy's debt review is considered weak by Standard & Poor's, but not because of the amount of debt you've got outstanding, but because of the amount of the city's unfunded pension liability and unfunded OPEB liability. That's what right now is impacting a little bit the debt metric that they look at. So generally what they look at for debt metrics are debt per capita, debt as a percent of full value of the property in the city, how quickly you pay back debt, how quickly you amortize it, how that's paying it back. The expectation would be, that you got a certain amount by year 10. And debt service as a percent of your budget, that's the other one. Generally, they don't want to see it go too high as a percent of the budget. Generally, self-supporting, non-self-supporting debt, you wouldn't want to see go above 10%. Generally, the debt per capita is low. Debt as a percent of full value of property here in Quincy is very low because the value of the property is so high. Debt service, how quickly we amortize debt? It might be a little slower than others, than some communities that have less debt, but most cities have a lot of debt, especially cities the size of Quincy. In terms of what goes into rating management of the community, they're looking at. No, go ahead.
You can continue. I just wanted to have a minute for a question.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to add that most, when you're looking at how to rank management, they've got some, what happened when the federal government in connection with the recession downgraded, Standard & Poor's downgraded the federal government from AAA to AA plus. So Quincy's rated the same as the federal government. But so what happened? So the federal government ended up suing Standard & Poor's. It gets involved storybook. So Standard & Poor's decided they'd redo their methodology and they'd make it extremely transparent. And they've done that in the course of the last 5 years. They show you exactly how they rate you and how they rank you. And so one of the things that they put out is a management piece on the 10 major factors of how they look at management. A lot of it has to do with the development of capital plan, capital improvement plan. A lot of it has to do with whether or not you're doing debt modeling, whether or not you're doing multi-year forecasting, taking a look at how your budgets will play out over the next several years. A lot of it has to do with fiscal policies relative to debt, these metrics I've been talking about, relative to reserve positions, how much reserve do you want to have if you've got operating surpluses, what are you going to do with it, those kinds of things. I know the city's in the process of developing, the city's had different plans, different administrations want to look at different fiscal policies. I know the city's currently got looking at various fiscal policies and is close to having done its diligence on what might make sense. So one of the things we've been doing is updating the debt model so that the city can look at what different debt scenarios would look like if it brought them on over the course of the next 5 years. One of the things that can't be ignored in looking at planning for debt is what's going on in the marketplace and what are interest rates like. We're seeing interest rates right now as low as they've been since 2012, and they've been declining for the last 10 years. So this is an opportune time. City's about to come to market. It's going to be in the market before June. It's going to be in the market in July. It'll be in the market. Typically, the city comes to market a couple times a year with a ban before year end, fiscal year end, and the diff notes are on their own schedule to be paid off over time.
So
That's about it.
I'm just going to stop it there.
That's good.
Well, I know a lot of this official perspective, which is greatly appreciated in this forum, so thank you for that. But we're just going to kind of ask questions and continue dialogue, so just...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Cindy. So a couple of things. One, it's great to hear what our credit situation is, right? So we're in a positive credit rating. You had talked, I just wanted to double back. I know Brad asked the question, I just was looking for clarity. 180 million is our total debt, of which 70 million of that 180 is the band, or are we adding the 70 on top of the 180? So there was band debt, our general debt, div debt. I just wanted to, is it cumulative or is it?
Yeah, well, just give me one second. I did. Well, as of June 30, 15, but I know it's higher than that now, it was 156 million
Total.
of long-term outstanding bonds. Okay. And then 62 million of interest on top of that. So it's 218 million of principal and interest payable from fiscal 16 through fiscal 2043.
Okay, maybe through Mr. Chairman, into the auditor. And
So
we're
it's 25
going forward
years.
for a future meeting, we can get some backup for that information. I guess I was looking to just, I guess that was my expectation tonight, is kind of seeing where we were. I know in previous review sessions, we talked about what projects and where they are, kind of in the amortization schedule. So I was just trying to get an idea of the total number. Do we know the number for the diff debt?
Yeah, absolutely. Hold on a second. They, hold on one second. Well, the city's got $40 million worth of diff notes outstanding.
Okay.
And those are in the process of being taken out piecemeal based on when they were issued.
Right.
Right, okay, so they were, so over the next, 3, 4, through the year 2025, it's planned right now that those would be bonded. They're in the form of a note.
I guess what was in our budget book that we can go through, and I don't expect you could have seen this, but it references the total debt service, overall spending to be reduced from 5.6 to 5.3% of our total budget. I guess maybe then through the auditor, I was just going to clarify whether the diff debt is inclusive in that number. I don't believe it is, but I guess for me with you here this evening, one of the things that we have before us is a capital improvement plan. You've come before us to say you're not borrowing enough, you're not spending enough with your excess levy capacity and what you could be doing, right? I think that's been some past advice.
I'm not saying you're not borrowing enough. I would definitely say that there's an opportunity lost by not dipping into the unused levy capacity.
Okay, so you might have got to put a big
But not necessarily to pay debt, but to consider other needs.
Well, and I think
OPEB.
right, okay, so actually I was looking at instead of paying down debt, maybe I didn't rephrase that the way I was thinking. I'm thinking the city has a lot of needs, there's a lot of infrastructure needs, there's a lot of deferred maintenance, things that are, you know, the time's come due. So the mayor has put together a substantial proposal, I think we had 50 slides worth of wish list items, and now it's a matter of what we can afford. So I think what I was looking for with tonight's presentation was if there's been discussion, maybe this is a subsequent meeting, as to what is the number that, you know, and I think of this with the capital improvement plan, you know, there's going to be projects that can be paid down with revenue streams such as water sewer, such as community preservation, right? So it's not all straight general fund borrowing, but I guess I was looking for what's affordable for the city at this point. What do you feel is our capacity as we're looking to take on additional projects and needs to meet the city?
Well, and like I said earlier, we do take out something that's self-supporting, and we try to mirror it to the debt service,
Right.
to what the revenue stream is, as if it were a revenue bond, but issue it as a general obligation bond because you can get better interest rates that way. With regard to what's affordable, and when you look at an affordability study, it depends on, that's a very subjective term, what's affordable. How much?
We get a real project list coming before us with real hard numbers.
Well, and we've modeled out a lot of the real numbers that you're looking at, I do believe, and the debt service, because of what's coming off the books, it doesn't go up that much with what would be coming on the books. And if you've got any kind of growth as you go forward, in terms of the, you know, the tax base, you should be able to afford it, so-called afford it, without much of an issue. But you've got a lot of other things that need to be done at the same time, which is to deal with the rest of your budget. And you have to maintain reserves, and probably at this point, you do need to grow the reserves some. With what happened in the last couple of years between snow and ice last year, and I think there was some of the reserves were used for one-shot capital expenditures the year before. You know, the reserve position is down a little bit. So the idea would be that you manage everything simultaneously, which is to bring on the new debt needs and afford them, so-called afford them, and at the same time as you grow your reserve and keep it constant as a percent of the budget in line with a fiscal policy that gets established, and that you fund, which is ascending needs, unfunded pension and unfunded OPEB. Those are ascending numbers. You've got fixed costs that are ascending. So I think at the heart of this whole discussion, I always find myself coming back to is what's the willingness of the city to tax the unused levy capacity? I'm not saying taxing all of it. What's the willingness to tax any of it? It's been growing. I remember when it was $5 million. It's $23 million in fiscal 16. So I guess that's one of the questions, because you can afford a lot more than is planned.
And then within regular budgets, those.
Within regular budgets, yeah. Yeah, that's not even looking at anything to do with the Prop 2.5 override or anything like that. That's just the city council doing.
Right,
Well,
the mayor's
and
office,
the
right,
administration.
proposing
Well,
tax increase.
well, yeah, I'm not saying it's just city council. It's just the administration and the city council. So,
I mean, I think that's interesting, you know, financial discussion, right, as you talk about what the projects that we have going on, and what did you do, what more is to come online. I guess I was looking at whether my thought would be obviously the capital improvement, and maybe through Mr. Jones or Mr. Walker, this is a discussion for another time. Would we be expecting a report from bond council prior to the capital improvement discussion? I just had thought that was going to be part of tonight.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, absolutely, Counsel. I think tonight our goal wasn't, Cinder can certainly provide any backup material that the council requests. Our goal was to sort of give everyone, especially for the new councils, an introduction of where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. As soon as we get into the weeds of, you know, actually having some request before you relative to some additional bonding. I'm certainly happy to have that discussion on what our specific position is, what the long-term projection would be. We've done some modeling, but frankly, no final decision has been made on what the first bond issue request will be before this fall relative to that. So we're just not there yet. We expect to be there within a couple of weeks. And at that point, more than happy to have that discussion, show the projections out and what it might mean budget-wise. We've done some of that to the council.
That was most of some of my questions where I was expecting to go to that, so I will look forward to that, but I believe, thank you.
Thank you, Counsel. I know that we had that discussion with the mayor in the last presentation of the capital plan, and I chatted with Cindy pre-meeting. I know the administration does a good job communicating with you on a very regular basis. We only meet several times a month, so we share the will of this body with the mayor to be actively engaged with you throughout the process, just so we can connect all the dots as well. And he had agreed to that. And sounds like Chris is more than happy to have that conversation. So I think in terms of expectations, if you're looking for a hard copy output leading into a discussion around a specific item, that will be requested. So point well taken.
Thank you.
With that, thank you, Counsel. Going to move it to Counsel Hughes.
Thank you. I don't think it's on. It is on me. Thank you. Hi, Cinder. How are you? Thanks for coming in tonight. Just a question regarding similar communities to Quincy. I know we get a lot of questions, a lot of constituents emailing us, comparing us to Boston. A lot of times, and we're talking about projects, we're talking about taxes, or we're talking about actually pretty much everything, comparing what we do here to what Boston does. And sometimes I think, I wish I could talk to people and tell them that sometimes an apples to oranges comparison, and we need to compare ourselves to other like communities in terms of size, in terms of financial capacity, tax levy, all those things. So could you just give us a few communities that you think of us as similar to, or I know you do modeling for the city and you do a lot of for other communities, but what other communities do you think of us in terms of as being like in scope and so forth?
Well, we usually would compare communities based on population or the size of the budget. I wouldn't compare you with the city of Boston, frankly. That's not who I would, and we also would compare you generally with like credits. So Boston is AAA right now. I would compare you to AAAs. When I compare, we did the last comparison we did for the city. When we compare it with AAAs, it doesn't look the same. It looks like it's a little bit, a little bit weaker. But I would compare you to the city of Somerville. So it's not so different in size, not so different in demographics. It's a rated AA plus. I think it's probably one of the best comparisons. I didn't compare you with them. I mean, it would be easy enough for me to compare you with a number of the other AA pluses. A lot of the other AA pluses in the Commonwealth are much smaller in population. And that's not usually, they don't generally share the same kind of needs. I mean, it's hard enough to compare two communities as it is, and it only shows you just so much because each community really has its own unique set of circumstances. But I can't think of, too many communities that have $23 million in unused levy capacity under the lower levy limit. There just aren't a lot. I might compare you with Lynn, but Lynn has a cap on how much debt it can issue, and it hasn't, hasn't issued a lot of debt. It's lower rated. It's in the A category. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't compare a AA plus Quincy with an A1 community. That's not a fair comparison, even though in terms of population, you might be closer to that. So there's not a lot. I'd have to take a look at whether or not I would consider, somebody like a large town. I would look at your peer. I would look at your surrounding communities, though. I might compare you with, Braintree, although they're not the same size. I might look at the communities around Braintree and Weymouth and take a look at that. But those are, again, I think we generally would compare with the other AA pluses. And I can put something like that together. We've got access to a lot of the data, and it just takes a couple of days. When I was talking to the city about it, I said, I still wanted to come and find out who wants what and that kind of thing, so. What we would do is compare you based on those metrics, primarily reserve position and, primarily reserve position and debt.
Yeah, I think we do often get a lot of comments about comparing us to Boston. I think it's unfair, to sort of compare some of the things that we're doing with Boston, just because, again, it's not a fair comparison, and good, bad, or different. We are a different community. I know in proximity we're so close to them, but it's not a fair comparison. So I want to be realistic in setting, the public's goals or minds in the right way as we get comments regarding budget or regarding, comparable communities or spending and things like that. And just think of it in those terms rather than always comparing us to Boston does this, Boston does that. Just because we're close in proximity doesn't mean that we're in any way a model or similar in financial respects for obviously population, but in terms of rating and credit and so forth. So thank you, that's helpful. Thanks. It would be helpful to actually put that together if that's something that everyone else would find helpful. And I think, as we go through the budget, or have in the past, we've talked about, in terms of salaries, in terms of things like that, we've talked about other communities and what they do. I know we had a salary commission last year, and that was discussed at length throughout the salary commission, comparisons with other communities, and at times I don't think it was always done in the right communities that would be helpful.
I think the Mass Municipal Association has been putting together a lot of salary information, comparable salary information. Now, that's not an area where
You do.
Analysts don't get into salary comparisons like that.
No, understood. I just think it would be easy to see, it would be helpful for us to look at communities that do terms similar to us as we look forward to debt and projects and setting the budget in general.
So in terms of, we look at the credit rating, the population, and probably the size of the tax base.
Okay.
When we look at somebody like a Somerville, they've got a number of different projects that they've done in their own work, so, and they're promoting economic development, issuing debt to promote that. It's the same kind of, I do see a similarity between, but, we're happy to put together comparative information if that's what the city's asking.
Yeah, it's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel. Counsel Finn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question really isn't directed necessarily to Senator here, but there seems to be something that's emerged this evening, and I want to be certain is that I know the mayor came before us with a plan that was, again, I didn't see any numbers associated with that plan, but it sounds as though you have been modeling this presently. Is that my understanding? Because I think we heard some reference to numbers in the city through you to Mr. Walker.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Council, there's been various modelings of various projects. Nothing that is set in stone at this point. I think as the mayor made it clear last week, his plan is to come back before you with some initial requests, not throw everything into one big package, and keep this body involved every step of the way, whether it's through subsequent appropriations. For example, a public safety headquarters, which was in the book. I believe our intention will be to request appropriation for some design study review money and not necessarily come in for an appropriation for a X amount public safety headquarters. So I think that's part of the game plan going forward. So those numbers are still a moving target at this point. It's exactly what the mayor is going to present to this body in terms of an appropriation request, at least up front. But there has been some further modeling done. There'll be more modeling done in terms of a full package of what would it be if we were to borrow tomorrow X amount for everything that's in the capital plan book.
Well, I think that the relevance of that, particularly from the issues that Councilor Forrest was raising at some point, I would expect we'd have a formal presentation of where we are with existing bond schedules and the like.
Absolutely. I think our intention was, as we get into the actual numbers and present some numbers, to have that ready for you at that time and say, this is where we are with this initial.
Well, it might be nice to have it, a little before that, quite
Understood.
honestly. But and again, I just think that to use your metaphor of getting in the weeds. That doesn't happen to us often here sometimes. So again, to the extent that that information can be made available would be deeply appreciated. But again, thank you for coming in. And I have heard different themes, again, because I've been here longer than most folks have now. But an interesting thing about our budget moving forward, and I know it's not, again, that's definitely from a larger perspective in which you view it, but interestingly enough, this evening before us, we do have a reserve appropriation for stabilization, and we do have a reserve appropriation for other post-employment benefits. And I'm going to guess that you're going to suggest that that's probably a good thing to have in place.
Those are both really good things, yes.
And I'm just curious, in relation to our overall budget, when people are referencing the model, is there some sort of benchmark of where we should be, what we should be shooting for?
In terms of
those accounts, the stabilization and the OPEB or whatever.
well, Moody's is looking for, so Standard & Poor's probably would accept less if there were different kinds of management and fiscal policies in place so that they felt that it was stable and that there weren't going to be variations. They always want to have enough flexibility to deal with something like snow and ice. You make back-to-back snow and ice situations, not just 1 year. So you can absorb it without decimating a reserve position. Moody's, so the Standard & Poor's has a bias towards strong management. They give you a lot of credit for strong management. You can make up for lesser positions on reserves. Whereas Moody's doesn't have quite that same bias, and this is my opinion. I'm not really speaking for them, but what we've observed is that they're more focused on demographics. And so when I said before that 30% of the rating is the local economy, that includes the value of the tax base, that includes per capita income, unemployment, family, median family income, all those numbers. So to the extent that your demographics are less strong than your peers, you would be expected to have higher levels of reserves. That's probably to some extent true of Standard & Poor's, but it's definitely more true, I think, of Moody's. So right now, the city, especially depending upon how much debt you're planning on bringing in the future, needs to cater to both rating agencies to some extent, and make sure that the city understands how they both think, because you've got reasons why you might want to have two ratings on a single bond transaction, depending on the size of it, and for marketing purposes. So, reserves generally would be anywhere between, at a minimum, they have to probably 5% of general fund to 10%. Moody's, again, errs on the side of being higher. You also can't, you have to worry about your peers because, you want to see how much your peers are doing. It's generally viewed as a percent of your revenues or as a percent of your expenditures, depending on which rating agency is looking at you. When we show you, if we show the city some comparables with AA pluses, you can see where they all stand with regard to reserve positions.
And this is best, if this is not a one-time, one budget, this should be kind of structured into the regular budget.
This should be something that is a practice, a policy and a practice and a procedure that's followed annually and never had to. That's why I was saying most municipalities in the state have improved dramatically. Back before when Prop 2.5 went through, we had more non-investment grade credits than any other state in the country. We've now got probably more AAAs and AA pluses than any other state in the country. We are perceived as very strong, very well run municipalities in the state and very well governed both by law as well as by the municipalities. For example, once you establish a practice, it's hard to undo that, the next year. Probably once if everybody likes it and follow it, it's, it doesn't have to be in the charter right, to the extent that it's formalized to some extent, and you tend to improve and add onto it each year and improve from year to year. And, that lends to credibility of the community. That's a big part of the grading also, that you deliver on what you say. So, it's every year. And it's something that that's why when you look at multi-year planning, for both capital and for operations, and you look at what you're facing and what you've got to figure out how to deal with, then you can make decisions today that position you well as you go forward to bring on everything that you want. You've got flexibility. I mean, the rating is really a reflection of your flexibility. I know I've said that before, but that's really true. So that you can deal with snow and ice, and you can still bring on the school, you can deal with the school project regardless of if interest rates go up, which they're gonna do.
If I remember correctly, I'm not certain, but as I understood it, and the reason why we have duration at this particular point in time is that's probably far more critical at this point than the unfunded pension liability.
Well, you're on a state mandated schedule to fund the
Right.
unfunded pension liability. You're not on any schedule to fund the OPEB. You might negotiate out some of those benefits. I don't know what the city's plan is relative to delivering on that, but right now your unfunded OPEB is considerably larger than your unfunded pension because you don't have any, you're not funding it, you have no assets to speak of in terms of funding it. And so you've got no assets, if you're not funding it in any way, then you're not earning any interest on any assets. So I think your unfunded OPEB is in $500 million number somewhere, and your unfunded pensions, under 400. So I think you've got $950 million of aggregate between the two, the majority of it is in the unfunded OPEB. What's happening is that as your peers start to establish the OPEB trust fund, as they start to fund it, they're not getting a lot of credit for that yet, but it is going to lend itself toward municipalities focusing on how are we going to deal with this? And do we need to figure out, maybe we need to, tap into the unused levy capacity, or maybe we need to cut back on benefits? I mean, that's not cast in stone. Talk about what's affordable. I think that's more of an issue of what's affordable. The debt is definitely affordable. The OPEB liabilities, part of the problem is debt is not ascending. Your OPEB liability is ascending from year to year, going with the unfunded pension liability. So that is something that the city needs to focus on, looking at its future budgets and figuring out, okay, how are we going to do this as we go forward? And should we levy more sooner than waiting to levy it when we're ready to our back up against the wall? There's an opportunity to levy a little bit now for whatever your purchases are, maybe it's OPEB, maybe it's something else.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Going to go to Counsel Bonner. I just want to do a time check with the group. We're at about 10 to 7. We have a hard stop at 7, so we can open the public hearing for the FY17 budget. Senator, if you'd be so kind, I'm not sure if we'll be through the sequence of questions. We'll probably continue that after it's 7:15. Sound reasonable? Okay. Counsel? Sorry, we got it. Right. Counsel Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your advice here, I guess. How long have you been really working with the city or with us? How long have you been doing this?
43 years.
43 years?
43.
43 years. That's okay.
I started working 43 years ago at Sean McBank, and they had worked with the city for years before that.
So you've been through a lot of administrations.
I've been through a lot of administrations. I've been in support positions, in management positions in my firm, and I've been through a lot of different firms that do the same advice. There's been a lot of consolidation and that kind of thing over the last 4 years.
Sure. Have you looked at our 5-year capital improvement plan? Have you looked at that package yet? That
Not
review?
in detail, no.
Okay.
What we've looked at are different assumptions we were asked to take a look at and provide the city information. So I haven't looked at it as closely as the detail exists.
Sure. Just a little bit of piggyback on Councilor Hughes here. She talked a little bit about the other towns and cities around us. Have you seen any other towns or cities do a what is called a debt service cap? Where this, like for instance, let's just body got together and say, hey, listen, you know what? We're at 5.3 right now. Let's make an ordinance or whatever at 6% and say, that's the cap. Does that happen in other towns or cities across this Commonwealth?
I don't see it, I don't see it. I mean, I wouldn't suggest you do that.
Okay.
The reason I wouldn't suggest you do that is, for example, that limits your flexibility. I'm not for, I think you should, it could potentially prohibit you from taking advantage of different situations and opportunities, including interest rates, low interest rates. You might find yourself in what we've seen and what a lot of other consultants are recommending is that a lot of debt be accelerated right now. I mean, there's a limit as to how much debt you can accelerate. and take advantage of interest rates, but I wouldn't put something in an ordinance like that. I wouldn't even put your reserve position, your fiscal policies in an ordinance.
Okay.
I think that it's important that the city follow whatever fiscal policies it concludes make sense for the city, and that you revisit them regularly, see if they still make sense. And I would stay within certain parameters that are guidelines for where you should be. But I think that you want to maintain the flexibility to do what you want. Instead of, another Prop 2.5.
Sure.
That Prop 2.5, when it went through, most of the cities had their babies pulled, and when they got when they were reinstated, almost every single one of them was reinstated at a lower rate just because of the property tax cap.
Sure.
Caps can be dangerous. I mean, if you you should be able to manage yourselves without caps.
You know, neighboring town like Weymouth, it didn't pass. The voters came through and they said no 2.5. So, you know, they're looking for economic growth. Kind of like what we're trying to do here is we're looking for this economic growth over here, this downtown development throughout the city, whether it be the North Quincy T Station. And my personal viewpoint is I'm looking for this revenue to streamline it to maybe piggyback off of what you're saying. Let's start, borrowing a little bit more. Would you consider yourself conservative or aggressive?
I'm pretty conservative. My advice is conservative.
Conservative.
Yeah.
So you're going to come with a conservative approach that, hey, listen.
Yeah, I would not give any advice that I thought would undermine your credit rating, or that would, that basically are guided by that. I'm very conservative. I wouldn't suggest you do anything that puts you at risk in that regard. And I make it clear that if there's risk associated with, if you're in a very short debt, and it's likely that that's going to undermine your credit, I would certainly suggest that. I'm already suggesting that the level of reserves might undermine the credit, that the city needs to beef up its reserve position. It's not the debt so much. I think that if you don't develop an OPEB plan, or not a plan, but an OPEB trust, and start putting some money aside to show that it's on your radar screen, I think that could undermine the credit. There's 100 things that could undermine the credit.
Lastly, just looking at Quincy right now, what do you think are kind of the three most important areas that you think we should spend or borrow or bond or whatever we call it? Off the top of your head.
To be honest, we do not make a recommendation that you should do a project or not do a project. So I really don't have anything about that.
Okay.
And otherwise, it's
I'll put you on the spot, that's
all
all.
the time.
Sure.
So we help you once the city decides what it should buy.
Okay.
There is a process for prioritizing capital, though, obviously.
Sure.
So you can prioritize based on, if the project's falling apart, or it's going to cost more if you let it continue to deteriorate, or if it's going to be self-supporting and you've got a revenue source already in place to pay for it, or if, it's a health and safety kind of thing. There's a lot of
Criteria, yeah.
prioritization techniques.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Counsel. Counsel Kane?
The questions that I was going to ask were mostly covered by Counsel Finn. Yield my time to Matt in the Forest.
Counsel Forrest. Did you have a quick question on the OPEB? I know Brian's got a sequence of questions.
You know what, I've got Counsel, I don't want you to see this road, I think we'll let that go. I just was looking at, as we're starting to pay OPEB, this is the first administration to start paying down our OPEB, where you thought that number should be. Every time you come before us, this is something that we realize is need to get, and a lot of communities aren't doing this yet. As the legislative money comes in, where would you like to see our OPEB contribution, budget contribution be?
Again, I do not have an answer for that, but what I would say is that I think you need to start getting on the radar screen, and the city probably needs to do a lot of evaluation as to what it could afford there and what it would do. I mean, the unused levy capacity, again, and I don't want to harp on that, but that is an opportunity for the city to consider. If you have $23 million of unused levy capacity with a lower levy limit, and I'm not saying you could possibly levy all that at one time. That would be crazy, I'm sure. But when you leave that on the table each year, so over the last 5 years, that's $100 million of taxing capacity that the city could have done. If you look at the demographics of the city, one like me, who doesn't live here, doesn't pay property taxes here, could argue that it's affordable to have a higher average tax bill. And the city, I think at the same time as the city considers what it can afford to levy, that the city needs to consider ways to potentially cut back the benefits and look at that expense and whether or not it's planning to, whether or not that is affordable. It's, it's a huge, it's a big number, and it's a number that needs a lot of attention from both sides, not just how you're going to pay for it, but whether or not the number's right. And a lot of communities have said, and a lot of the communities that don't have the capacity of Quincy have said, there's no way we're going to pay that. We can't afford it. So I think that, that's a whole separate study and analysis for the city.
The city has a financial fiscal responsibility, right? So I'm going to defer them to Council Comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel. For us, it's about 3 minutes to 7. Counsel, I don't want to have you get going and then cut the commercial. Would you, if you wanted to come on at about 7:15, so we can open up the public hearing. Appreciate your indulgence. Cinda, thank you very much. We'll bring you up in about 15. At this point in time, we are going to declare this part of the hearing closed. Take a minute or two before we get to the whole hearing.
Would you have to go today? No.